At Thanksgiving. My mother looked straight at me and said, "Having you was the biggest mistake of my life." My sister smirked. Dad stared at his plate. I nodded once. Good to know. 2 days later, Mom called screaming. "Why is a realtor taking pictures of our house?" I answered. Our house. She went silent. For 5 years. My parents had called that place theirs while I quietly paid the mortgage gap. Taxes, insurance, and repairs. What Mom had forgotten was what she signed the day I saved it, and the realtor wasn't the real surprise. Before I explain what happened next, hit like, comment where you're listening from, and tell me after hearing that, would you still keep paying? My name is Meredith Vale, and for most of my life, being the reliable one sounded like a compliment. By 41, I knew better. I worked in commercial property risk, which meant my days were spent looking at buildings, contracts, insurance gaps, and all the quiet problems people ignored until they became expensive. I was good at spotting what could go wrong before it did. At home, that same habit turned me into the person everyone leaned on. I remembered deadlines. I handled paperwork. I noticed when Dad's prescription renewal was coming up or when Mom had forgotten to schedule something. If a family trip went sideways, someone called me. If Thanksgiving needed organizing. Somehow the list ended up in my hands. Jocelyn never had that role. She was 6 years younger, married, had 2 children, and had always been easier for my mother to celebrate. Mom loved introducing her as the one who gave us grandchildren. When people asked about me, she usually said, "Meredith has her career, not cruel enough to challenge, just dismissive enough to stay with you." Jocelyn knew the difference too. She had spent years being forgiven first and questioned later. I had spent years hearing, "You're older. You understand." Dad was different, but not enough. Frank Vale was 70, retired, quiet, and deeply committed to avoiding conflict with my mother. He rarely joined in when she took a shot at me. He also rarely stopped her. That distinction took me years to understand. My parents still lived in the same 4-bedroom brick house in Matthews where Jocelyn and I grew up. Every holiday, everyone called it Mom and Dad's house. I called it that too, mostly because correcting them would have made the room awkward. And I had been trained since childhood to believe awkwardness was worse than resentment, so I kept quiet. I paid attention, and I let my family forget something important. 5 years earlier, when my parents were in serious financial trouble, that house had changed hands legally. There had been an appraisal, a closing attorney, a signed deed, mortgage documents. My parents had received their equity, and the buyer whose name went onto the title was me. They remembered the rescue. Somehow, they had forgotten what that rescue actually meant. 5 years earlier, my parents were not months away from losing the house. They were already in serious trouble. Dad had been pushed into retirement after a hospital system downsizing. His salary disappeared. At the same time, the mortgage had fallen behind. The home equity line was nearly maxed out, and several credit cards were carrying balances Mom and Dad could no longer comfortably manage. Mom had also gone through medical expenses that turned every month into another calculation. They tried refinancing. The lender said no. Dad's income had changed. Their credit had taken hits from missed payments. The numbers no longer worked. A realtor told them the cleanest solution was to sell, take the remaining equity, and move somewhere smaller. Mom refused. "I'm not losing my home because your father lost his job." That was the sentence I remember. Not because it was cruel, because it made clear what mattered to her. The house had become more than property. It was proof that their life had stayed intact. So I offered another option. I did not quietly take over their mortgage. I did not sign some family agreement at the kitchen table. I bought the property. There was an independent appraisal, a real estate attorney, a lender, title insurance, closing documents, and a deed transferring ownership to me. The house appraised at about $465,000. After the mortgage, home equity line, and closing expenses were paid, Mom and Dad received $45,000 in remaining equity. I used about $112,000 of my savings and investments for the purchase and reserves. Then we signed a 5-year occupancy agreement. They would stay in the house. They would pay $1,150 a month plus utilities. I would carry the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, and major repairs. At the time, it felt like the best answer available. They kept their home. I kept them out of foreclosure. Nobody had to move. What I did not understand was how quickly a legal sale could turn into a family myth. Within a year, Mom stopped saying, "Meredith bought the house," she started saying, "Meredith helped us refinance." Dad rarely corrected her. Neither did I. By the 5th year, the occupancy agreement was 4 months from ending. The house cost more every year. And 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I had already asked a realtor what it would take to sell. I was still considering one more renewal. Then my mother told me I had been the biggest mistake of her life. Thanksgiving arrived with 12 people packed around the dining table in the house everyone still called my parents' place. Mom had spent the afternoon talking about tradition. Jocelyn's kids were running between rooms. Aaron was carving turkey. Dad was opening wine. An aunt brought sweet potato casserole. For a while, everything felt ordinary. Then Mom started talking about the future. She looked around the room and said, "I just want this house to stay in the family." Jocelyn smiled. "One day, we could open up that wall between the kitchen and dining room." I looked at her. She laughed. "Someday." Mom jumped in. "Well, someone has to think about the next generation." Then came the familiar comparison. Jocelyn understood family. Jocelyn made time for the important things. Jocelyn gave them grandchildren. I had a career. Mom did not say that last part with pride. She said it like a diagnosis. I let most of it pass. I had spent years doing that. But when Mom started talking about leaving the house to the grandchildren someday, I finally said, "Maybe we don't need to plan anyone's inheritance over pumpkin pie." The table quieted. Mom's expression hardened. "You always do this." "Do what? Turn everything into paperwork and money. I didn't bring up inheritance. You always have to correct people." I could feel everyone around us suddenly becoming fascinated with their plates. Jocelyn leaned back in her chair. Mom kept going. "You've been difficult since you were a child. Everything has to be your way." I said nothing. Then she looked straight at me. "Having you was the biggest mistake of my life." The room went completely silent. I turned toward Jocelyn. She smirked. Not a laugh, just a tiny, satisfied curve at the corner of her mouth. Then I looked at Dad. He stared at his plate. No objection. "No, Patricia, enough! Nothing." That hurt more than I expected. I looked back at Mom. "Do you mean that?" She lifted her chin. "You wanted honesty." I nodded once. Good to know. That was all I gave her. I did not mention the deed. I did not mention the mortgage. I did not remind anyone whose name appeared on the property tax bill. I helped my cousin find her coat, hugged the kids goodbye, and drove back to my condo, at home. I did not cry. I opened the folder I had been avoiding for weeks. Mortgage statement, occupancy agreement, repair estimates, the Realtor's market analysis, a projected roof replacement. March 31st circled on the calendar. For 6 months. I had been asking whether keeping the arrangement made financial sense. That night, I asked a different question. Why was I still volunteering to preserve a version of family that only seemed to value me when I was useful by Friday evening? I had my answer. I was done renewing it. The house had survived their crisis because I stepped in. I no longer believed that meant I had to carry it forever. Saturday morning. I called the realtor I had spoken with 3 weeks earlier. Her name was Melissa Grant. "I'm ready to move forward with a spring sale," I said. She did not sound surprised. We had already discussed the occupancy agreement, the March 31st end date, the likely repair list, and what the house might bring once it was vacant. She asked if she could stop by that afternoon to update the exterior photos and market notes. "That's fine," I said. "Please stay outside for now. My parents still live there, around noon." My phone rang. "Mom," I answered. "Why is a realtor taking pictures of our house?" I let the words sit for a second. "Our house," silence. Then her voice sharpened. "Don't play games with me." "I'm not. What is she doing there preparing for a spring listing?" Mom went quiet again. "Then, you're selling, yes. You can't just decide that. I can decide not to renew the occupancy agreement. It ends March 31st. You're throwing us out over Thanksgiving." "No, Thanksgiving made the decision easy. It didn't create the numbers. She scoffed. What numbers? So I told her, the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, and average maintenance were costing me a little over $3,000 a month. Mom and Dad paid $1,150. I covered the rest. The year before, I had also spent nearly $14,000 on HVAC work, plumbing, and exterior repairs. I've been reviewing this for 6 months, I said. I was deciding whether to renew for another year. I'm not renewing. Mom's answer came fast. We let you put the house in your name because your credit was better. There it was, the rewritten version. No, I said. You sold it to me. That is not how we saw it. You signed a deed. Dad signed it too. The old mortgage and HELOC were paid off. You received your equity at closing. You know what I mean. I do. You mean the legal sale became inconvenient to remember once you got comfortable. She hung up. Dad called that evening. He sounded tired. We thought this was our home. It was your home. That never made it your property. Your mother says things when she's angry, and you say nothing. I didn't agree with what she said. You were sitting 3 feet away. He exhaled. I didn't want to make it worse. For who? He had no answer. Before we ended the call, I told him I would give them until March 31st and put everything in writing through the attorney. I would honor every day of the agreement. No lock changes, no shut-off threats, no surprise buyers walking through while they still lived there. I was ending an arrangement, not declaring war. I thought that would be the hardest conversation. Then Jocelyn called. Her first words were, "Mom says you're selling my inheritance." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard her. That was when everything changed all over again. Jocelyn did not sound confused. She sounded offended. "Mom says you're selling my inheritance." I sat down at my kitchen table. "You're what the house?" For a second, I thought she was repeating one of Mom's dramatic phrases. Then Jocelyn explained. Apparently, for years, Mom had been telling her that one day the house would become hers because she had the children and needed the family home more. Jocelyn and Aaron had already talked about moving in eventually. They had even paid $2,400 for preliminary kitchen drawings. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because my mother had promised away something she no longer owned. "Jocelyn," I said, "you can't inherit something Mom never owned. She owned it for 25 years, then she sold it 5 years ago. That was temporary." "No, it was a closing." I walked her through it again. Independent appraisal, attorney, lender, signed deed, parents received their equity, 5-year occupancy agreement. There was no secret clause saying the house would magically return to them later. Jocelyn got quiet, then angry. "Mom said you just handled the refinancing. Mom says a lot of things that become more convenient than the documents. You knew this was supposed to stay in the family." "No, I knew I bought a house so they would not lose it." She exhaled sharply. "You make more money than they do. That doesn't make their housing my permanent responsibility. They're 70. They also have pension income, Social Security, and 4 months to choose somewhere they can afford. So now they're supposed to rent because you're mad. I was already considering selling. Then you should at least pay their rent." I paused. "Are you offering to silence?" Then came the reasons. Her townhouse was too small. The kids needed their rooms. Aaron's commute was difficult. They could not take Mom and Dad in. Of course. Jocelyn wanted the inheritance. I was supposed to keep the obligation. Monday morning. My attorney sent formal written notice confirming that the occupancy agreement would end March 31st. I gave Mom and Dad roughly 120 days. I also sent them information on 3 reputable 55-plus communities with 2-bedroom units in their budget. I offered to pay for 1 licensed moving company when the time came. That was it. I did not apply for apartments for them. I did not call leasing offices. I did not pack their boxes. Mom called that afternoon. "You're doing this because of 1 sentence." No, 1 sentence made me stop pretending 5 years of sacrifice was appreciated. "You're punishing us." I'm ending an arrangement that was already becoming too expensive. "You don't do this to family." I almost said something cruel. "Instead," I said, "you don't promise someone else property you sold 5 years ago either." Mom asked whether I planned to charge them for the years they had lived there. I said no. Their monthly contribution had been the agreement. The repairs and extra costs were choices I made. I was not turning old generosity into debt because I was setting a boundary. Dad called me separately that night. I didn't agree with what your mother said. You were sitting 3 feet away. I didn't want to make it worse. Worse for who he started to answer. Then stopped. For the first time. Dad had to sit with the fact that silence had never been neutral. It had simply meant the cost of keeping peace was always paid by me. And this time, I was finally done paying it. The next 4 months were quieter than I expected. Mom stayed angry. But the written notice changed the argument. There was nothing left to debate about whether I was serious. The date was on paper. Dad and Mom toured the 3 communities I had sent them. Eventually, they chose a 2-bedroom apartment in a 55-plus complex about 20 minutes from Jocelyn. It was smaller than the house. It was also something they could afford without me covering half the cost every month. I kept my word through March. The insurance stayed active. Repairs that were necessary got handled. Nobody changed locks. Nobody threatened utilities. Nobody showed up with buyers while my parents were still living there. When moving week arrived, Dad called. "We'll take you up on the movers." Okay, that was all he asked for. Jocelyn helped Mom pack dishes and framed photographs, but she never offered her townhouse. I noticed that. I also stopped resenting it. Their choices were finally becoming their responsibility. The afternoon before, Dad handed me the keys. He stood in the empty living room for a long time. Then he said, "I should have said something that night." "Yes." He nodded. "I'm sorry." There was no excuse attached. No, your mother was upset. No request for me to change my mind. That made the apology matter. Mom was different. At the door, she said, "I hope selling this place was worth losing your family." I looked at her. "I hope someday you understand those were never the same decision." She walked away without answering. After they moved, I repaired Ware, repainted several rooms, and listed the house in spring. It sold for just over $600,000. After the mortgage payoff, repairs, agent fees, closing costs, and taxes, the remaining proceeds were mine. Not because I had taken anything from my parents, because they had sold me the property 5 years earlier. Jocelyn never received the inheritance Mom had promised her. She stayed in her townhouse. Mom and Dad stayed in their apartment. Nobody became homeless. Nobody lost everything. And when the sale finally closed, I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt relieved. For the first time in 5 years, part of every paycheck was no longer supporting a house occupied by people who had mistaken my sacrifice for something permanent. A year later, I lived in my condo. The difference was that my money belonged to my future again. I increased my retirement contributions, rebuilt the savings I had drained, keeping the second property afloat, and stopped treating every family problem like an invoice with my name on it. Dad and I repaired things. He called more. He listened more. Most importantly, he stopped asking me to pretend silence was harmless. Mom and I remained low contact. She sent birthday cards and occasional texts, but there was no apology. Jocelyn stayed distant too. No more comments about inheritance. No more assumptions about what I would eventually give her. The next Thanksgiving, I did not return to the routine. I spent it with friends and 2 cousins who brought wine, dessert, and no expectations about who should sacrifice for whom. For years, I had protected my parents' dignity so carefully that they started believing my sacrifice belonged to them. It never did. I did not take their home away. I stopped paying to preserve that illusion. Would you have renewed the agreement after what Mom said or sold the house too? Comment below and subscribe for more family betrayal and clean revenge stories.